guys, it's Jess and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if it is your first time here. Today I'm going to be talking through the books I read in the month of February, and I read 4 books this month, so let's just jump straight in. I'm going to talk about was a reread for me, and that was Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. I picked this up just because I was really feeling in the mood for some morally grey characters, and I knew that this book would tick the boxes. I also loved it so much that I know for a fact that particularly in the latter half of the book I raced through it. So I really wanted to take my time and savour it in this reread, and honestly I loved this book as much the second time round as I did the first time. There were a good number of details which I'd either forgotten or perhaps passed me by in my race to find out what happened, and I really just enjoyed jumping back into this world. If you're not familiar with Six of Crows, this is the first book in a duology. It's a fantasy book in which a group of shady and morally grey characters are invited to win their fortune by completing an impossible heist, and the leader of this group, Kaz Brecker, is making a play to be the leader of one of the criminal gangs in the city where it's set, and it is just absolutely fantastic. There is magic, there is tension, there is a little bit of romance, but that completely sits on the back burner and just is done to perfection, and I just love the characters in this book. If you enjoy character-driven novels, then I definitely think that you will enjoy Six of Crows. But honestly, a book about a heist, a book about morally grey characters set in a fantasy world which features magic, I can't say anything more than that about this book. It's absolutely fantastic, and I am so excited for any future work that Leigh Bardugo writes, because this was just incredible. The next book that I read was Scrappy Little Nobody by Anna Kendrick, and it took me what felt like an absolute age to get through this book. I am a huge fan of Anna Kendrick. Pitch Perfect 1, 2 and 3 are some of my all-time favourite guilty pleasure movies, and I was really excited to read this book. I thought that it was going to be really amusing and offer an insight into who Anna Kendrick was as a person, and on the whole I think it did all of those things. It wasn't as interesting as I had expected it to be. I found that Anna Kendrick is attempting to be like a normal person, and she may well view herself this way, but when you're talking about someone who is an A-lister, when you're talking about someone who is a very well-known household name now, it's very difficult to translate that from that into how she was talking about herself, and I found it a little bit unbelievable at places, and I think that that's what put me off. But having said that, that's quite unfair, because equally if she'd written a book in which she was like, look at me, how fantastic am I, don't you just love me, I would also have been put off. So she had quite a difficult task when it came to my expectations going into this book. But I did find it amusing in places. It was an interesting look at her life. It was an interesting look at where she'd come from. And I didn't know a lot of the story in this, that she'd started out on Broadway and then kind of gone into indie movies. Obviously, I knew her from Twilight because I'm also a Twilight fan. But it just wasn't quite what I was expecting. And as such, I gave it 3.5 stars. It was okay. It was interesting. I think that if you're interested in Anna Kendrick as a person, then you will probably enjoy this. But it didn't blow my socks off, and I'd kind of hoped that it would be more amusing than it actually turned out to be for me. So an okay read, but not brilliant. The next book that I read was a buddy read with some of my favourite bookish people on YouTube, and you'll know their names if you've watched any of my videos before. It was Jordan, Katie, Molly and Julie, and it's been an absolute age since we've read anything together, so we decided to pick up White Oleander by Janet Fitch. Now if you watch any of the other girls' videos, you'll probably hear them talk about how much they really enjoyed this book, and unfortunately I just don't fit or fall into that category of reader. This is an incredibly dark novel about a young girl whose mother is a poet, and when she is a young child, her mother goes to prison for killing her lover in a crime of passion, and we follow the daughter Astrid as she is thrown into various horrendous circumstances in the American foster system, and as she really comes to terms with who her mother was and how their relationship was perhaps a little bit more toxic than she first realised, because as most children do, when Astrid was younger, she idolised her mother and she thought that her mother could do no wrong, and as we begin to see more of her mum's relationship and her mum's personality revealed, Astrid basically comes to the realization that her mother was very poisonous and her relationship with her mother was very poisonous. And I struggled with this novel. I could read it and appreciate that the situations that Astrid was going through were awful and horrendous, but the way that the story was written, I just didn't feel any connection to Astrid at all. And having spoken with the girls and chatted, I kind of agree with their interpretation that maybe that's how it was supposed to be written and you were supposed to be kept at a distance from Astrid, because ultimately, because of her mother, she was a damaged child, and so she would want to keep people at a distance. But not having that connection really made it difficult for me to sympathise with her. And at the same time, I just found it to be an incredibly depressing novel. I also think that it could have been a whole heap shorter than it was, and it's not a massively long book, but by the latter half, the whole thing was just starting to drag for me. So it's a good book if you enjoy this type of novel. I would definitely suggest having a mooch around on Goodreads and seeing some of the other more positive reviews and whether you think it's the kind of book for you, but for me this one just did not tick the boxes. And then the final book that I read this month was the Bookish Mama's book for February, and that was The Secret of Nightingale Wood by Lucy Strange. Now this is a middle grade book, which I didn't know when I first started it, and then subsequent research, because I was a little bit puzzled at the level of the writing, kind of revealed it to me and helped me make a lot more sense of this book. So this is a middle grade book aimed at children aged between 9 to 11 years, and we follow a young girl called Henry whose family have moved out into the country following the death of her brother, and we don't know the exact circumstances of how her brother died going into the story. The story is set in 1919, and Henry's family are incredibly fractured following this tragedy. Her father leaves to go and work abroad because he can't quite deal with his emotions. Her mother is heavily medicated by a meddlesome doctor because she's struggling with the effects of grief and postnatal depression, I would say, because shortly after her brother Robert dies, Henry's mother gives birth to another child, and then there is Nanny Jane, who is kind of the only constant in Henry's life. And so to deal with all of the things that are going on, Henry kind of retreats into a literary world where she reads about some of her favourite bookish characters. And then shortly after they move in, Henry spots a fire in the woods near their house, goes to investigate and meets a witch-like character called Moth, and from there the story kind of unfolds. This was, in a lot of ways, a very stereotypical story about the time. You know, women were oppressed. It touches on mental health. It touches on mental health institutions and how awful they were for women in certain circumstances because women didn't have a voice. It is very much a coming-of-age story of Henry coming to terms with what happened to her family and trying to keep her family together, and the pressures that children can take on themselves at that age. And in that respect, it was incredibly moving. I find that this book was quite difficult to place because on the one hand I thought that the writing was incredibly simple, but on the other hand I thought that some of the subject matter was a little bit dark. But I don't think that this would be a particularly good book for teenagers. I think that they would find the writing and the overall plot a little bit too simplistic, so I definitely would place it around the older end of the middle grade range. Overall, I did enjoy it. Some of the plot lines were a little bit too convenient and a little bit unbelievable. There's a whole scene, or a whole series of scenes at the end where Henry takes action and everything is just a little bit too far-fetched to be believable. But I think in kids' books that's a little bit more acceptable, and there's kind of a magical, mythical undertone to the whole book that sort of lends itself to the series of events that happen. So I was willing to suspend reality in order to just go along with what the story was. And yeah, overall I enjoyed it. It's not a blow your socks off amazing kids story, but I do think that it is an important one. It talks a lot about the war, it talks a lot about mental health, it talks a lot about women and women's roles, and I think if you wanted a good entry-level book to open discussions with your children about those topics, then this is probably a good one to start with. So this was definitely a bit of a on the fence type of book. So they are the books that I read in February. I had a little bit of a mixed month. I started strong with Six of Crows and then didn't really love any of the other books that I read. So fingers crossed that in March I read some truly amazing things. But as always, thank you for watching. Do let me know what you read in the month of February and what you plan to read in March, and I will see you all soon.